I'm extraordinarily excited about bears. You're working on bear baiting in the 16th century, which is fascinating and also politically and emotionally sensitive for many, many people in our time. There's a long history of this. And so just tell us about the project, where you are.
Yeah, thank you. Well, we're right at the start of the project is the first thing to say, and we've got another 2 and a bit years to go. We're running until August 2023, but it's a really exciting collaboration between some animal archaeologists, some ancient DNA analysts, and some archival and literary scholars. I was lucky enough to be approached by the bear archaeologist, best job title in the world, Hannah O'Regan. And in a way, it's sort of an attempt to do something like Before Shakespeare to the baiting arenas, to ask why they're there, why they happen, why then, and why there. And it's grown into a much bigger project, really asking about bears and animals in the early modern period. And in the first 2 months on the project, Callan Davis, who's leading the archival work, he managed to find nearly 2,000 references to bears in Tudor and Stuart England. And when we were writing the funding bid, one thing everyone kept saying to us is you won't find any evidence of bears, so there's no point even checking. And we've just found thousands of references to bears. You couldn't move in early modern England for a bear. One of my very favorite facts is that bears regularly stopped traffic in early modern England. People stopping their horses, stopping their carts, stopping walking on the street to stare at the bears. There's a really great line in a John Lilly play, Mother Bombie. One character turns to another and says, "Are you there with your bears? Are you there with your bears?" And it turns out the answer to that question is everybody was there with their bears. Bears absolutely everywhere. So we're having lots of fun with the project. As you say, the act of baiting itself is not remotely fun, deeply unethical, cruel sport, but just hugely popular, and has been surprisingly understudied, I think, as a practice. There's some brilliant scholarship on it, but I don't think that scholarship has been integrated well into wider accounts of theatre history. And again, I was talking about the person walking down the street saying, do I go to a theatre? Do I go to the Curtain? You've got exactly the same options happening here. And I'm becoming increasingly fascinated in the South Bank area where you have the Globe and you have the Rose Theatre and you have baiting arenas. I think rather than that being a site of competition for audience, actually, these places are acting as a magnet for footfall, for people to come and to mingle and do all the things that we've not been allowed to do under COVID. And I almost wonder if we're really looking at an early example of a zoo or an animal-based fair, because not only have you got the baiting arenas, but you've got the kennels, you've got the ponds in which the animals drink and wash. You've got this site in which, again, you can come and look at the animals. So I think it's an incredibly important practice in the period. And one of the things we've discovered looking beyond London is that so many English towns actually have spaces for baiting right at their centre. So the kind of, if you look for Bear Road in particular English towns, if you look for the Bear Inn, the Bear Inn seems to be where the baiting happens. It tends to be on Bear Road. You can see how central this act is to the English imagination. So that's what we're looking at. The ancient DNA analysis is aiming to find out things like the gender of the bears, potentially the breed of the bears, potentially where they're from. We can use things like dental records to think about their age and their health. We can look at bones to think about trauma marks and therefore to think about the kinds of combat that they're engaged in. And then we're hoping to put that all into dialogue with how baiting is imagined in the period. And baiting is deep into the heart of the way Shakespeare thinks about certain characters, particularly at the ends of plays. Famously, Macbeth ends the play just comparing himself to a baited bear. Gloucester in King Lear, as he's about to be blinded, says, "I am tied to the stake and I must stay the course." So characters in Shakespeare repeatedly compare themselves to a bear being baited. We're also, just like with Before Shakespeare, we're keen to work with contemporary practitioners. And in this case, we're working with a group of professional wrestlers because we want to think about what it is like to perform combat in front of an audience. One of the things you do if you run a bear baiting as a practice, we actually have found the diary of a bear ward. So someone who owned a bear and was traveling around the country, we're able to trace this man for 2 months around England on a day-to-day basis, sometimes on an hour-by-hour basis. And that the 2 bears he had, these poor bears, are being repeatedly baited, not just across days, but across months. So the last thing you want when you're staging that is for the blood sport to become actually dangerous to the point where the bear can't fight the next day. So these are staged, managed performance events. So we're going to work with professional wrestlers. Professional wrestling grows out of much the same logic, really. You know, if you're making money from being a fighter, you need to be able to make money as a fighter the following day. So introducing levels of performance into what you do is the way to make that happen. So those are the sorts of ways in which we're approaching baiting. I don't quite know what we're going to find, but I'm really looking forward to it.
I was always under the impression that the bear died at any given event, that they would bring in enough dogs and that the bear died. But these are sort of gladiator bears that can survive a given event and probably were expected to survive. And
yeah, so lots of bears become celebrities. Fascinatingly, a lot of the bears are linked to particular places in England. So it's almost like a bit like football in the UK now, people cheering on for their team, cheering on for their local bear, perhaps. Certainly lots of dogs will have died, but actually the archaeological evidence of the dogs, and again, we're just at the start of this project, I should stress, but we have found hundreds of dogs, and the thing that surprised our archaeologists is just how old the dogs are, and that there is evidence that when bones have been broken, they have been reset by humans. So we are seeing a history. Firstly, we're seeing a history of cruelty, but we're also seeing a history of care. And so that's surprising too. So there may have been stage management around the dogs as well. These are massive dogs, mastiffs, for which England was famous going back to the Roman period. And there's a real cultural association of Englishness and mastiffs, kind of predating the more familiar association between England and the bulldog. And so the dogs too may well have been cared for, and their safety may have been managed as part of this sport.
This is wildly good. And you have an article on this.
It's a book on literary animals.
Literary animals.
It came out before the project, I should say. So it's not really about bear baiting. It's actually about dogs on stage. I should say the project's called Box Office Bears, and our website, boxofficebears.com, is the place to look. We're publishing primary documents up there, transcriptions and photographs. We're making some animations about some of the stories that we're discovering, particularly around bears on the streets in England. And actually one of the biggest discoveries of the project so far is how often bears accidentally get into people's houses. Terrifying, right? We keep hearing again and again about bears, being let loose by the bear ward. They lose control of the animal, and it just goes into somebody's house. Terrifying, absolutely terrifying.